Welcome back, everyone. This is part two of my look at Atun-Shei's Why Gods and Generals is Neo-Confederate Propaganda and Objectively Sucks. And I want to take some time just to kind of talk about yesterday, the first episode, for those of you who are watching this later on, and just address some of the comments that many of you have left. Typically, on an average video, I will get about one comment for every 100 views. That seems to be about the average. So if I have 20,000 views on a video, there'll be about 200 comments. That just seems to be about the average. The average on my first video for this one was about 4 times that many. So obviously it's something that evokes a great deal of opinion, a great deal of emotion, a great many viewpoints. And that's exactly what I was after. I do not pretend to claim that my viewpoints are the only correct ones. And I guess maybe that's part of what frustrates me so much with Atun-Shei in this video series is that, at least to me, and this is just my perspective, he comes across as stating that his view is the only correct one and anybody who disagrees with him is wrong. I won't make that claim. I can only share what my perspective is. I have a very particular upbringing in a very particular place at a very particular time. And as we all know, how we were raised, the situation we were raised in, the experiences we have growing up, where we were born and raised, our socioeconomic status, our race, our gender, all of these things play into our perspective and how we view things. So I won't pretend to claim that my view is correct and other people's aren't, because other people have different perspectives. And so I would expect people in different parts of the world, in different backgrounds, with different upbringings, to have a different perspective on this. Just as I expect him to have a particular perspective that's going to be different than mine. All I'm trying to do here is to offer another perspective, to say how I see things. Not that I see them correctly, but just to say this is what I see and how I disagree with what he sees from my own perspective. And so thank you. Thank you to every one of you who offered your perspective and your views, especially those who disagree with me, because many of you disagreed with me strongly on this, but did so in a respectful way, and I appreciate that. And that's all I'm hoping for. We're probably pushing 1,000 comments on the first video at this point, 24 hours in. And I would say probably 995 of them were respectful. There were a couple of people who were insulting or degrading or just rude about how they responded. And you know what? I just delete those and don't even really consider them. So if you want to be heard, that's not the way to do it. I read every single comment. Obviously, it gets exhausting to respond to all of them, and I could spend all day just keeping up with comments and never do anything else. So please don't be offended if I don't respond to your comment, but understand I do read them all, and I appreciate every single one, no matter what you agree with or disagree with about what I said. So real quick, before we dive into part two, and in part two, I think you're going to see that I agree with a lot more of what he says. I want to just address some of the most common things that people said and give you my perspective on those. Not to say that I'm right and you're wrong, just to say, here's what I think about those things. So a number of you commented on my observations about Atun-Shei's background, and some of you seem to have taken great offense at me stating that he grew up with a lost cause perspective and that somehow there was something wrong with me bringing that up. Let me tell you why I brought that up. The last time, actually, in any of the other videos that I have done reactions to with his stuff, that's usually the first thing that his defenders point out is, hey, he grew up believing in the lost cause, and these videos are his attempt to refute that. So his own supporters constantly go to that when disagreeing with me or when offering a different perspective, and when I disagree with him, they say, but wait, here's why he's doing that. So the reason I brought that up is because that's what everybody says. And so I was trying to get ahead of that and say, listen, I get it. I understand this is where he's coming from. It wasn't an attempt to insult him. It wasn't an attempt to somehow take away from what he's saying. I was just accepting the fact that that was the perspective he was coming out of, because I know a lot of people will say that. So, and to point out the fact that I didn't come from that perspective. I wasn't saying I'm better than him because I never fell for the lost cause and he did. I was just saying, because that is the case, we're coming at this from two very different perspectives. In fact, I have a great deal of respect for anybody who grows up in a certain belief system or grows up with a perspective and through maturity and through experience comes to refute something that they later discover to be wrong or to be out of place. So I respect him for that. I have a great deal of respect for him saying, listen, I used to fall for this and I'm not there anymore. I've grown out of that, and to acknowledge that, I respect that. So I was just making that observation, not to criticize. Another thing, a lot of people were saying, well, he has a filmmaking degree, so I'm really not in a position to question his observations on the choice of score and the choice of how things are done. If that is the case, then my own history background would then preclude anyone from disagreeing with me about perspectives on the historicity of these things, right? That's ridiculous. A person's education does not protect them from criticism. My background in studying history in college does not mean I'm automatically right about everything in history. It does not protect me from being wrong about something. It does not mean that my perspectives on history are the only correct ones just because that's my background. Likewise, just because he has a degree in filmmaking does not mean that I can't see filmmakers' choices differently than he does. Just as multiple people with filmmaking degrees are going to see the same thing differently. You know, I'm just saying, you know, that doesn't protect him from criticism. My main issues, though, aren't about the filmmaking choices, because I'm not in a position to criticize those. And honestly, my response to this video isn't even about whether or not I think Gods and Generals is a good movie, because as many of you have pointed out, many of you said, you know what, I don't think it's propaganda, but I think it sucks. And that's fine. I do have a problem with him saying it objectively sucks. Because anytime you say something's objective, what you're saying is the facts are this and they can't be disputed, because that's what objective means. Subjective means it's open to interpretation. My view of it might be different than someone else's. A lot of people like Gods and Generals. A lot of people think it's a good movie. So it's not objective that it sucks. But I don't take issue with people who say that it sucks. There are a lot of things I think do suck about it, and I express some of those. And honestly, I think it would have been a much better film if, like Gettysburg, it had just stuck to the military stuff. Most of the stuff I don't like about it is when they get away from that. So I'm not taking issues with the filmmaking part. Another thing, a lot of people say, well, maybe it wasn't the filmmaker's intention to make it propaganda, but it's unintentional propaganda. My only response to that would be Atun-Shei didn't leave room for that. He made it quite clear that it was intentional on the part of the filmmaker to be propaganda. He repeatedly said that these were intentional choices made to specifically promote a certain thing. That's what I take exception with. Any film can be used to promote an ideology unintentionally. You know, a perfect example is there was a film that came out a number of years ago. I can't remember what it was called. I think Leonardo DiCaprio might have been in it. That a lot of people used to argue that people became school shooters because of it, because it portrayed a school shooting scene. Now, was the intention of the filmmaker to get people to commit mass shootings in schools? No. Did people use it to justify that? Yeah. That doesn't mean that the filmmaker did it intentionally. So are there people who use Gods and Generals to defend their ideology? No question. Was it the filmmaker's intention? He says it wasn't. The filmmaker does. And I have no reason to argue with that viewpoint. That's kind of where I'll leave that. As for music and how it makes us feel a certain way, many of you said, hey, Filmmakers use music to get the audience to feel a particular emotion. Won't disagree with that. Not a filmmaker, so I'm really in no position to argue with that. But I would say, and some of you agreed with me on this, that sometimes I don't see it that way. Sometimes I see filmmakers using music and dialogue to help me understand what a character is feeling, not to tell me what I should be feeling. And I saw those scenes that way. I saw the scenes with the music, for example, in the movie Gettysburg, where all the Confederates are cheering Robert E. Lee. They were helping me to feel what they were feeling. Never once did I think this filmmaker is trying to manipulate how I feel. Now, a lot of people can disagree with that, and I can't take exception with how you see it. I just don't see it that way. One last one, lies by omission, and this is a big one, and I think this is something we're going to talk about in this episode. A lot of people argued that it's not so much what they show as what they don't show, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that. I would challenge that from this viewpoint. Every film does that. The movie The Longest Day, for example, shows the perspective of the Germans, shows the perspective of the Americans. At no time in the movie The Longest Day do we get an in-depth look at the Holocaust. Was that going on? Yes. Is it portrayed in the movie? No. From the argument that many of you have made, that is a lie by omission. You are showing German soldiers fighting to defend the coastline of France while not showing the fact that the Germans were systematically eradicating millions of people at the same time. Both are true, but that wasn't the perspective, that wasn't the point of the movie The Longest Day. The movie Patton shows George S. Patton as a war hero. It shows some of his flaws with slapping a soldier. At no point in that movie did they show the fact that Patton was a flaming anti-Semite who actually, in his private diaries, almost sympathized with the Germans putting them in internment camps. Does that mean it's a lie by omission because we didn't see that side of him? No, because that wasn't the focus of the movie. It's up to me to do the research and find out that those things are true. Now, we are going to get into the fact that they do choose to show some perspectives of slavery, and they do tend to be one-sided with that. I won't take exception to that. That's why I think Gods and Generals probably would have been better served just to focus on the military, and I think it does that largely. Pretty much every scene where we see the military, or we see scenes that aren't directly connected to battles, it's still focused on the military. We're still seeing Stonewall Jackson, things like that. We do have the Lacey family where we see kind of some of the scenes of slavery and things like that. So I will grant that because they chose to open that door and show some perspectives on slavery, that it's a fair criticism to say they only showed one side of that argument. But I don't buy into the fact that just because you don't show something, it's a lie by omission overall. That said, let's dive into this. And I think you'll find that I agree with some of what's said here.
There are 3 black characters in Gods and Generals, and they're either super down with the Confederacy, or they want to be free despite the fact that they love their masters.
I love them people you done chased from this house. I've known them most all my life.
This is how the actors describe their characters in the film.
If I was born in that time period, I would have been subservient, yes. I would be doing the yawsum and nosum and, you know, trying to survive. But I think that because of who I am in the back of my mind, it's like, you're going to take me only so far. And then at one point, I'm going to say, no.
It's easy for somebody to say, oh, well, honey, I'd just get on out of there. Well, maybe you would, but where are you going? You know, you might run to that North Star, but Martha had 3 little children. What are you going to do?
These are fair points. In the Louisiana Slave Revolt of 1811, a quarter of the slaves of the German coast region joined the rebellion, but 3/4 remained loyal. Was this because they had genuine love for their masters? In certain cases, yes. But for the vast majority, They decided not to take up arms because they calculated the risks of revolt and decided that it was likely to fail. Sadly.
Not only likely to fail, but again, like she mentioned, there are other considerations. There's family. You know, it's one thing if you're a single 20-year-old healthy male and you can fight and you don't have family, you don't have other people that you're worried about leaving behind. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of considerations there. It's not that these people didn't want to be free. It's just that there were other considerations. There were other things that they were thinking about. And you see that when Grant's armies, for example, start marching into Mississippi. As soon as these people have a genuine opportunity where they know they can be free and they've got a good chance of being able to get to the Union lines and being safe and not having to be returned, they jump on it by the thousands. People that always wanted to be free, but like he said, they calculated the risk, and now there's that opportunity, and that's why by the thousands they start to do that.
They were right. You see this same calculation in revolts and revolutions all throughout history. In the Jewish revolt against the Romans in the 1st century AD, much of the violence was between competing Jewish sects, some pro-revolt, others pro-Roman. The Romans eventually won.
Judean People's Front. The People's Front of Judea.
Great movie.
In King Philip's War, the Mohegan tribe, among others, sided with the English colonists against the native confederation that opposed them. The English eventually won. And in the American Revolution, Tories across the colonies clashed with rebels both politically and militarily. The rebels eventually won, against all odds. The instinct of self-preservation is biological and deeply ingrained in all human beings. But loyal American slaves weren't like this.
Y'all be coming on back here.
They were like this. I'll grant you that loyal slaves existed, but I question Ron Maxwell's choice to feature these slave characters specifically in his film.
So here's my issue with what he just said. He first said they weren't like this, but then 10 seconds later he says, okay, well, some of them were like that. I agree with him that it's by choosing to portray slaves at all, you kind of open yourself up to the criticism that, hey, how come you only portrayed them that way? That's fair, and I won't argue with that. I will take exception with the fact that he says that it didn't happen like this. I can see why it's misleading, though, because you only portray them that way, and you leave people open to the idea that you are implying that that's the only way they were portrayed. But likewise, if you showed a movie where every slave owner was constantly whipping his slaves and being horrible to them, that would also be misleading because I should back up. Let me preface all of this by saying, don't hear me as saying that there's any such thing as a good slave owner, because the bottom line is no matter how kind you were to your slaves, you still were owning other people. And so by its very nature, slavery is unkind. So yeah, you could treat them well, but you still owned them. So I'm not going to, fall into the trap of saying slave owners were good to their slaves. They may have treated them well, but still owned them. And so there's an inherent unkindness in what they do. But yeah, they weren't all people that were beating them and whipping them and talking down to them and raping them. A lot of slave owners did have this kind of relationship, but it is misleading.
And no others. This is a whitewashed, hugely historically inaccurate portrayal of American slavery. It wasn't like this. It was like this.
It was both. It was both. It's not one or the other.
Come on, where's your Merriman? Move your feet.
The way I see it, if you're a filmmaker and you want to portray American slavery, you have an obligation to depict it accurately. This PG-13, kid-friendly, cotton candy bullshit leads the general movie-going public to think that slavery wasn't all that bad.
For that matter, though, isn't it fair to say that the movie as a whole is kind of a PG-13 look at these events? I mean, the Civil War was brutal and awful. And for the most part, the whole movie is pretty PG-13 when it comes to how it portrays events. So I'll grant him that it definitely, if they're going to, like I said, going to open the door to showing slavery, they have an obligation to show it more accurately.
And that has dangerous, real-world ramifications. Now, this might strike some of my longtime viewers as somewhat hypocritical. In the past, I've defended movies like Braveheart against those who obsess over historical inaccuracy. But ultimately, it doesn't matter whether the general public thinks William Wallace wore a kilt. It does matter that they think that slaves were happy and loved their masters like family.
I loved them people you done chase from this house.
Fuck you, Ron. This movie is basically a dry chronicle of the...
And see, this is part of what causes me to have such a kind of dislike toward Atun-Shei. And it's just his personality, and I get that. This is how he does things. I just wish that if you're going to offer a critique of something, you could stay away from the personal insults, the F you, Ron kind of stuff. It's that kind of stuff that causes me to question his objectiveness in all of this. And say that, you know, that there's this kind of knee-jerk reaction, this kind of hate toward him, the whole questioning stuff and making accusations about the character of the filmmaker, and then turn around and and have your supporters be offended when I question where you're coming from. Yeah, I think we could do without that kind of stuff right there.
The events of the first 2 years of the war in the Eastern Theater. I'm sure a huge amount of research was done on troop movements, battle tactics, and the lives of the soldiers portrayed. Thousands of Civil War reenactors took part in this film, men deeply concerned with getting minute historical details absolutely correct. So it's deeply ironic that Gods and Generals is one of the least historically accurate movies ever made, for the simple reason that it deliberately omits the true horror of slavery.
Gentlemen, let us lift our glasses to our Southern women, without whose bravery and fortitude, without whose love, without whose endurance and sacrifice, not a man among us can stay the course and defend the cause.
Sell her.
That might seem like a good place to stop on this topic, but
I'm not done yet.
there are two black characters who help out the Confederate Army. There's Jim Lewis, who's Stonewall Jackson's free cook, and this guy in the Confederate hat, who's also a free man of color, who only appears in the extended edition of the film. Here's his deal.
Where's your master now?
I ain't got no master no more. Now he my boss. See, I was sold at auction up in Fredericksburg once, and he bought me for $1,200. Then the war come, that didn't set right with him, so he gave me my freedom papers. Now he pays me wages.
You know, black people had it pretty good before those goddamn Yankees came along.
Then them Yankees come and burn down his house, and the next thing you know, the man who's paying me wages is in the Confederate Army. And so am I.
He's not really in the Confederate Army. Black men were forbidden by law to enlist in the Confederate Army.
I will say this. Now, I agree with everything. That scene, I don't like. And he's got a fair criticism here of how that is portraying things. But they were forbidden by law from being soldiers in the Confederate Army. But the role this guy's got here as being like a cook or whatever, you know, supply, whatever he's doing, I can show you examples of men who are listed as colored or free persons of color who are on the muster rolls for Confederate units. But they were cooks, they were orderlies, they were, you know, things like that. They weren't soldiers that were fighting. So as a historian, I will disagree with what he's saying here while also agreeing that this is really misleading in how it's portraying things. And that does come across as kind of having an agenda. So I get that.
Jim and the guy with the hat,
That's an impeccable hat, sir.
Thank you, sir.
represent a tiny minority of African Americans who aided the Confederate war effort. The vast majority, yeah, you guessed it, were slaves.
Yeah.
They were forced to work manual labor in support of the Army. Confederate apologists will often point to the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, a unit raised in my own city of New Orleans, as definitive proof that black Confederate soldiers existed. In actual fact, the Native Guard was made up of mixed-race Creole free people of color who were themselves part of the aristocratic planter class. Yeah, we've always done things a little differently down in New Orleans. And they never seem to mention the fact that the Native Guard promptly switched sides when the Union Army captured the city in 1862. Anyway.
Yeah, and Louisiana and Mississippi had some of the very earliest black units that fought for the Union. And they fought for the Union in huge numbers. We're talking 200,000. So I won't disagree with anything he's arguing here.
Anyway, later on in the film, Hat Guy's master dies in battle, and this is what he has to say.
This here rebel, give me my freedom papers.
For Christ's sake, can we have one black person in this movie who doesn't regard white people with unconditional loyalty and affection?
Fair.
Just one. But perhaps Gods and General's greatest crimes against history are the lines put in the mouth of Jim Lewis.
Lexington is my home, General. Same as y'all. If I could do my share in defending my home, I'd be doing the same as you.
Oh my god, this movie hurts my brain. The tragedy here is that Jim had some potential to be a really interesting character. A free black man deciding to support the Confederacy to earn a wage and survive, but who has family still enslaved and is struggling with conflicting loyalties. I'd like to watch that movie. It could have been original and ballsy and something that really would have taken audiences out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, but would a black man in that situation have been ballsy, I guess is my question. I don't think he would have gotten into that position without having a pretty subservient attitude. So I understand what he's saying about how that's the character they chose to portray, but I disagree with him saying that there was an opportunity there to use that character, because I don't think that character in that position would have been in a position to be that kind of person. I understand what he's saying. I just don't think that character is the way that they could have done that and have it be historical.
But remember, this movie is incredibly dumb, and Maxwell barely skims the surface of that potential. In this scene, Stonewall and Jim share a prayer, and Jim essentially challenges the general about the Confederates' defense of slavery.
How is it, Lord? How is it a good Christian man, like some folks I know, can tolerate their black brothers in bondage?
And that's an excellent point. And here's how Stonewall Jackson saw this, and I'm not defending how he saw it, because I disagree with him. Stonewall Jackson believed that slavery was wrong. But like a lot of Southerners who claimed they believed slavery was wrong, he owned slaves, which to me, is very difficult for me to accept, that you claim one thing but do another. I just think there's a hypocrisy in that. He viewed, as a man of very deep religious faith, he viewed slavery as something that God allowed, and that because God allowed it, he was okay in participating in it, which, again, I think is ridiculous, because God allows murder. He doesn't stop murders from happening. That doesn't mean he's okay with murder. But he did violate, for example, Virginia law by allowing his slaves to learn to read, things like that. So I guess as far as slave owners go, he was rather progressive, but that doesn't excuse any of it.
In a smarter movie, this remark would maybe cause some tension in Jim's relationship with Jackson. Maybe it would cause Jackson to have doubts about the righteousness of the Confederate cause and question whether the preservation of slavery really is part of God's plan. Instead, he says this:
Jim, you must know that there are some officers in this army who are of the opinion that we should be enlisting Negroes as a condition for freedom.
Yeah.
That's what they says round the camp.
I doubt anyone's been saying that round the camp. This was a fringe belief in the Confederate Army. And if certain officers advocated enlisting slaves as a condition for freedom, they would not have been talking about it publicly in 1862. It would have seemed insane. The Confederacy was still doing well. It was holding its own against the Federal juggernaut. The first Confederate officer to seriously propose this was General Patrick Claiborne in 1864, after the tide of war had turned firmly against the South.
This wasn't the first time that would have been suggested. The same thing had happened in the American Revolution, for example, where they offered to do just such a thing, to allow blacks to enlist for condition of freedom. Of course, George Washington eventually shut that down and didn't allow it, but it did happen for a while. The British certainly did allow that.
Early in 1865, General Lee came out in support of the idea, but the Confederate Congress didn't authorize the use of black soldiers until March 1865.
By then it was too late.
Things were getting really desperate. In any event, it was too little too late, and Lee surrendered to Grant a month later.
Your people will be free. One way or t'other.
The best lies flirt with the truth, and Jackson's stated position on slavery is no exception. We actually know very little about Jackson's actual opinions on this, and much of what we do know comes from the memoirs of his wife Anna, written 30 years after the war. Stonewall was somewhat unique among high-ranking Confederates in that he came from a working-class background, and spent much of his childhood and adolescence working his uncle's mill. He probably worked alongside slaves every day. It's entirely possible that due to this experience, the young Jackson considered slaves more as people than as property. In the 1850s, Jackson ran a Sunday school for slaves and free people of color. Lost causers will claim that such a school was illegal, and that Jackson was some sort of early civil rights pioneer. But in truth, there were many other schools like that in Virginia at the time. So was Jackson one of the good...
They were illegal. That doesn't justify the fact that Jackson owned slaves. So it doesn't excuse him because he did that. Good for him that he was willing to do that. It was a step further in the right direction than other people were willing to go, but it doesn't make him a hero.
Confederates, like Longstreet and Mosby? It's hard to say because he was taken from us so young, but it's important to note that before the war, he was a fairly typical upper-middle-class slave owner. In Gods and Generals, Jackson's own slaves are notably absent, even in scenes taking place at his house in Lexington where they would have lived. Stonewall owned at least 6 slaves, and according to Anna, he was a very strict but kind master, giving his servants that which is just and equal, but exacting from them proper obedience. His training made the colored servants as polite and punctual as that race is capable of being, and his system soon showed its good effects. They realized that if they did their duty, they would receive the best of treatment from him. At Christmas, he was generous in presents, and frequently gave them small sums of money. As for Jackson's political views on slavery, Anna says, I have heard him say that he would prefer to see the Negroes free, but he believed that the Bible taught that slavery was sanctioned by the Creator himself, who maketh men to differ, and instituted laws for the bond and the free. He therefore accepted slavery as it existed in the southern states, not as a thing desirable in itself, but as allowed by Providence for ends which it was not his business to determine. At the same time, the Negroes had no truer friend.
A truer friend would have freed them.
This seems to jive with what we know of Jackson's...
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's my issue with it, is if you are so morally opposed to slavery, you have it within your power to release those. That's what Ulysses S. Grant did. He was gifted a slave by his father-in-law who owned slaves. And he chose to free that man at a time when the money he could have gotten by selling that slave would have been huge for Grant. So we do see that it's morally possible to do the right thing, even if it would hurt you financially, because Grant did.
Intense religious belief. But as Anna had a vested interest in keeping Jackson's legacy as squeaky clean as possible, I find it hard to believe that black Americans had no truer friend than Stonewall Jackson.
That's fair.
But what does slavery and the Confederacy mean to Ron Maxwell, our director? Well, I'm sorry to say, he's almost certainly one of those it's heritage, not hate, don't take the statue down, it's history type of people.
See, I get really uncomfortable when we start making assumptions about people like that, where he says, oh, he's almost certainly one of those kind of people. That's where prejudice comes from. That's where you get hate from, when you start making assumptions about a person. Because when we start making assumptions, then we only see what we want to see in people. So if I believe a certain group of people are a certain way, then all I see are things that prove that. And if they say anything, well, I dismiss it. So, if I decide, for example, that I think Atun-Shei, is a certain political belief and he hates certain groups of people, then I will hear what he says and interpret it in such a way that proves my point. And anything he might say that directly refutes that, I'll ignore, or I'll say, well, he doesn't really mean that, or he's just saying that to throw us off. Once we've decided on something, we only see what we want to see. So that concerns me when you make assumptions about anybody.
How do I know this? If you're watching this, Ron...
So I'm looking at, he's using his Facebook posts. I don't see anything there that...
Set your Facebook
I'm
posts
just going
to private.
to move past that one.
So that was a heavy topic. These past few minutes of the video may have made you angry or uncomfortable.
No,
some of you
I actually
might be
agreed with
taking to
most
the
of
comment
this.
section now to call me a virtue signaler or a white knight or a soy boy. Trust me, I've heard them all. But I just want you to know that the reason I often talk about American slavery and criticize the lost cause isn't because I have white guilt or because I want to feel validated with fake internet points. It's mainly because when I was a young, impressionable history buff making Civil War movies in the woods near my parents' house, bad history from biased lost causers and propaganda films like Gods and Generals convinced me that the war wasn't all about slavery, and that the Confederacy fought for a noble cause, and that the antebellum South wasn't all that bad. When I started to learn the truth, I felt like such a fool. How could I have been taken in by this nonsense? If I can provide a solid resource with good history, if I can reach just one young person who might be entertaining these ideas and convince them otherwise, then this video will have done its job. If you still don't believe me at this point, I'm not sure that anything that I can say can change your mind. So I won't try. I'll let you hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Did you know that we actually have audio recordings from the 30s and 40s of former slaves talking about their experiences? Yeah. Right now, in the 21st century, you can listen to the voices of American slaves. And I gotta warn you, the picture they paint is not pretty.
Well, they taken that old woman, poor old woman, carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can. And round the tree and whipped her. And, well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet. But it just had her clothes off down to her waist, Just didn't have her plumb naked, but they had her clothes down to her waist. And every now and then they'd whip her, and then snuff the pipe out on her, snuff the pipe out on her. The embers in the pipe, where you ever see the pipe smoking.
Blow them out on her?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord.
All right, so like I said, I agree with most of that. Slavery was evil. Many slave owners did horrible, horrible things to their slaves. Many of them raped them, had children with them. I am the descendant of a woman who was a slave, who had multiple children, and she herself was the child of her slave owner, who had relationship with one of his slaves. And she had multiple children from many different men, some of whom were white men, some of whom were black men. And I'm not claiming that gives me any moral, superiority in addressing this topic. I'm just saying there's no getting around the evil of slavery. It absolutely was, and it should be loudly proclaimed as such. So I'm not going to really say much more about it than that. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm not going to address the third part of the movie because that's really out of my area of expertise, because I believe the third part of his video here has to do with filmmaking choices and stuff like that. And really, there's nothing I can add to that discussion because that's not my background. But let me know your thoughts about all of that. And like I said, I'm probably not going to respond to a lot of comments, but I will be reading all of them. And I want to hear your opinions, your perspectives, because I do not think mine is the only one or that mine is the right one. It's just my perspective. It's just my view on things. Yours are valid too, and I've enjoyed hearing from people, even those of you who strongly disagree with me. So keep it coming. We'll probably come back with something a little more lighthearted after this. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you again soon.